Well, hello. Hi, Tony. It's good to see you again. And I am Ellen Goldfarb, and I am the director and creator and one of the producers of the documentary film New Wave Dare to Be Different. And we premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2017. And we've had an amazing journey ever since. And the moment that rocked my world was when I started making this film. So it's great to see you.
How long did it take you to make the film? I mean, did you kind of literally do the rounds and go straight to the people? I know you work with if you can explain, with Dennis, obviously. Well, tell us a story about WLIR for starts.
Sure. So I grew up on Long Island, and I grew up in the 70s and the early 80s of listening to WLIR in the beginning stages of it. When I started, it's been around for years, since the 50s, but when I started listening to it, I was born in 65. So it was a rock station. It was like a progressive rock station. They would play, I don't know, like the Grateful Dead and Joni Mitchell and kind of things that were they would start to play a little bit more of the like alternative kind of stuff of the 70s that wasn't really hitting mainstream radio. And eventually in like the late 70s, I remember they started to mix in some different kinds of music other than what we consider classic rock now, or that Grateful Dead, Joni Mitchell kind of stuff. They had a short period where they really championed like all the Southern rock bands like Leonard Skinner, Marshall Tucker. That the Long Island had a scene around the late 70s where they were really championing those bands, and there were a lot of, I remember, bands playing that kind of music. But in the late 70s, they started to incorporate, more like CBGB kind of bands that were coming out of New York in the late 70s, like Blondie, the Talking Heads, Television.
The Ramones.
They were playing, the Ramones were huge in the 70s. I saw the Ramones at my father's place in the late 1970s. So I was a kid. I was like 16 years old, and I remember going to see them. David Bowie, they were playing more of that kind of stuff, more like getting into what was going to be more of like the punk scene. And then all of a sudden, I remember like in the early 80s, they started playing more and more of this stuff. And then in 1982, all of a sudden, the radio station switched, and they dropped all the classic rock, and they were only playing this kind of music, but it was nonstop. It was 24/7, and all these like songs were coming out and bands that nobody ever heard of. And I was like, wow, this station's really cool. And it felt like when you were listening to it, you were part of like the secret club, because I grew up on Long Island, so the station, it was kind of like not a college station, but it was a station where you couldn't get the signal certain parts of New York. Like if I would drive certain parts of like Westchester or Rockland County, you couldn't get the signal. Or I remember driving into Manhattan and I would lose the signal, and then in certain parts of Manhattan you'd get the signal. But I remember when I was able to, the drinking age was 18. By the time I turned 18, I was able to go to all the clubs. So I would go to like Spit and the Malibu, and there were so many of them. My father's place, there was Rum Runner, and so all this music was being played at these clubs, and I was like, oh my God, they're playing the music I listened to on LIR. And then you would meet all these like-minded people that listened to that station, so it became like a secret club. And anyone that listened to LIR, it was kind of cool, and I had some friends that were like, I never heard of Blamage, or I never heard of The Cure, or any of these cool bands. And I was like, yeah, like I know all this cool music. I'm cool, That's because I listen to LIR. Anyway, so it became, they just kept bringing out all these new songs, and I remember just listening. You didn't want to stop listening to the station because you'd miss something. And they had the Screamer of the Week where they would introduce new songs of the week, and voters would, I remember we would call in and vote for our favorite song of the week, and those became hits. Like, and no other station was doing that. Like, the DJs became like your friends, and you would call them up and you'd speak to Larry the Duck or Malibu Sue, and you'd request a song, and they were just so cool. And you were like, where are they going to be tonight? Oh, they're going to be at Paris, New York. I'm going to go to Paris, New York because Larry's spinning. Or and so the DJs became club DJs as well as being radio DJs, and you'd follow them. And it was so much fun. It was just a really fun time to be growing up and being involved in music. So when I went to I left for college in 1983, and I remember, like, I would come back on breaks and I'd have my little tape recorder and I would tape LIR, even the commercials, because the commercials were awesome. And I would just I would buy like 120-minute tapes, and I would just let the tape recorder tape, and then I'd bring the tapes back to college so I didn't want to miss anything. Didn't want to miss a beat of what was happening on LIR. And then when I came back in 87, 88, it wasn't LIR anymore. It was a new station, DRE, and it wasn't the same. They were still playing that music, but at that time, then the grunge era was starting, and some of the DJs had left, and I didn't know what happened to LIR. It was so confusing. Like, it was LIR, then it was DRE, then eventually it went back to LIR, the call letters, and I was like, what? This is so bizarre. Like, nobody ever talked about like what actually happened with this station. And then, now it's years later, and on Facebook, I noticed there were these tribute pages to LIR, and people were posting on Facebook like, do you remember this song? And now we can post like YouTube videos, and people were talking about LIR and about the songs, and I was like, oh my God, I remember that song and that song, because they don't play that music anymore on regular radio. It's like, this is 80s. But some of these songs I never heard outside of LIR. Like, some of these songs were like considered like your one-hit wonder songs. And so, eventually some of these bands did get famous, like U2 and, some of these other bands. I mean, they launched from LIR, from getting that exposure back then. They were nothing. They were all even keel on the same level. And then some of them just got really big, and some had one-hit wonders. But anyway, and I love the one-hit wonders. I feel like those are the most nostalgic, the most fun, or like the really early U2 songs that never got played. But in any case, so I was on Facebook and just like, wow, like, whatever happened to that radio station? Here it's 30 years later. It's no longer on the air, but there's all these people that still love LIR, and there's like all these followers. So started to do some research on whatever happened to LIR, and I realized, wow, like, there's a really interesting story here. And has anyone ever made a movie or documented about it? So I was talking to my brother. He's a film writer, screenplay writer, did Broadway shows, whatnot, and he's in the business. And I said, what do you think? You think we should work on a project about this radio station? And he's like, yeah, it's a great story. He's like, I'm super busy right now, but why don't you do it? I'm like, okay. So I started to do research and realized that, I had to read. I remembered Dennis McNamara. He was the program director, and I remembered that. And I always loved listening to him. He just had such this calming voice, and he was always like a great interviewer. I remember he used to have, amazing interviews with all the artists, and he was like one of my favorites. So I'm like, I gotta reach him, because I know he was the program director, and I know I needed to get him on board. So he was the first one that I tried to find, and WLIR.com or .fm, there was a website dedicated to WLIR, and a guy named Bob Wilson was the person who created the website. And so I said, I wonder if this guy knows how to reach Dennis. So I reached out to Bob and I said, I'm interested in making a documentary about WLIR, and I need to reach Dennis McNamara. And he was able to, we spoke on the phone, and he was able to connect me with Dennis. And from there, it was just like the magic just happened. It was at first, Dennis and I thought, well, maybe we should make this into a theatrical film, and maybe we should do it where there are it's a story about a young girl who would have like been me, who had a dream of being a DJ, and this was her favorite radio station. So we had all these characters and whatnot. But then when we pitched it to a few of the big, we pitched it to my brother's talent agency and whatnot. They were like, this sounds more like, I think your sister should steer more in the documentary route. I was like, great, that was great feedback. So we started to then reach out to all the DJs, and then club owners, and then from there music executives, and then from there the artists, managers, whatnot. And the whole process took 7 years from start to finish
Just one
to
thing,
make
Ellen.
this.
When you came upon the original idea, were you kind of thinking Cameron Crowe, Almost Famous type movie?
Kind of, yeah. Yeah.
It just occurred to me when you were saying that, but then again, you just been following, so to do it the way you did it was probably the right move.
Yeah, thinking back, for sure. I mean, it would have been a fun story. And I mean, we had all these ideas like Broadway show. But no, I think, really documenting the story of what was the story of LAR, what was the rise and fall of this radio station, because it really had an interesting story as far as a 3-part act. Every successful film has, act one, act two, act three. And who are the protagonists? Who are the antagonists? It's like any story. And you can't have a successful documentary film, even a documentary, without having those components, without having a story. So, I watched a lot of documentaries before I made this one, and some of them, I was like, I don't get it. What's the story? What happened? What was the start? What was the middle? And what was the end? What were the messages that I was supposed to get out of this? And you can have a story about any radio station. There were other people that tried to make radio station documentaries, but they didn't have a story. It was like, okay, great. So there were DJs and they played certain music. Great, but what's the story? And this documentary had a great story because it was, the story of it was almost like a David and Goliath kind of a thing. Here's a radio station that was battling all the big stations of New York City with the vicinity in which they were able to reach people, and LIRs was smaller, but they did something that no other station did. There were other stations back in the late 70s that were playing similar music to LIR. There was a station here in LA, KROQ, and they had, Rodney Bingenheimer and some other great DJs that were also pretty world famous, similar to Dennis. But they never did what LIR did back in 1982. Each of these stations, there was a station, I think, in Boston, there was one in San Diego, and eventually, they were all trying to do what LIR was doing. But LIR in 1982 was the only station in the country that went 24 hours, 7 days a week with playing this music, and that gave them the ability to be on the forefront of breaking all these artists, because they dedicated their format to only new music, new wave music, punk, whatever you want to call it. All this music that was coming out of New York, that was coming out of England, that was coming out of Germany. And they played all of these. They didn't care if you were a bigger band or a one-hit wonder. They played it. They would have weekly DJ meetings, and they would play all this music and decide, okay, what are going to be the nominees for the Screamer of the Week? And they would put those up and they would let the audience vote, which no other station did either. You know, and because I live in Los Angeles, and I interviewed a couple of the DJs that were on KROQ, and they said no, they were still playing classic rock, mixing this music in, but they weren't getting all of the music in that they wanted to, like LIR was. So they would work with the LIR DJs, and some of the music would cross over from LA to New York. Like some of the DJs would communicate with each other. There wasn't internet back then, but they had phone and however else they would communicate. But yeah, but LIR was playing it nonstop, and so the agents and managers from Europe were like, "Oh my God, there's a station in New York that's playing all this music. We got to get our bands over there." So they would send demos over to Dennis on airplanes through JFK Airport, and the DJs would literally go to the airport and pick up these records and bring them back to the station. That's how, I mean, it was real raw, old school ways of doing things. We worked with a company called Dutch East Indie Company, and they were also getting imports and bringing them to the station. We had, or they had, artists dropping imports off at their doorstep and like knocking on their, and I mean, so it was incredible what was happening. And there were so many, I mean, LIR is world renowned across, I mean, they're just so well respected in the industry because of what they did. That, you know, all the music executives that worked for, you know, these small, like Island, but are now working for Universal Sony, but they were smaller labels back then. I mean, they all have so much respect. So a lot of those music executives were interviewed and are in our film. You know, it was important to get them in because it was a great, you know, way to see their side of the story of like, wow, this is what was happening from our perspective. LIR was a huge asset to us for getting music out there. The artists, all the artists I interviewed really wanted to pay homage to the station because, again, that was their gateway to America, or that was their asset of getting their music played as well. Music managers, DJs at the time, everyone was following this little radio station. So it was, you know, and then the interesting part of the story was they were operating without a legal FCC license because of their history. So there was all this backstory about the old owner and what was going on with the FCC and how they eventually lost their license. And then it was just remarkable. But it was a 5-year period. I mean, they've been a station since the 50s, but it was this 5-year period from when they switched over 24/7 to new music station until they lost their license. That's the exact time that I documented. And I know some people were like, but wait, they were playing that music before they switched over. Yeah, we know that. They didn't just wake up one day and the music was in the station. No, they were playing that music in the 70s, but we wanted to document when they crossed over and played it 24/7 and what made it, because otherwise the documentary would have been, you know, 5 hours long. So anyway, that's how we made the film to what it was. And that's how it, you know,
it must have been a great way to revisit your youth as well, because you can almost wallow in the self-indulgence at the same time of thinking this was me growing up. You're the director and you're the audience at the same time.
Yes, I was a super fan and the director and the producer. So it was a labor of love. And, you know, music is such an important part of people's lives. People, you know, people transport back in time, back to things that bring them joy. It could bring them sadness. It can bring them a lot of emotions when they hear a certain song, you know, and I wanted people to really have a feeling, to feel something powerful when they watch this movie, not only to enjoy it and bring them back in time, but I wanted them to walk out of the theater with emotion. And I really feel like we conquered that, because with the feedback that I get, everybody that sees the movie, whether you grew up in New York or not, it brings you back to that time and brings you back to memories of growing up, high school, college, ex-boyfriends, ex-girlfriends, friend, whatever, people that your parents, whatever transpired from that particular song or that music you listened to. That's what we wanted to really, really have, people feel. And that was it. That was my main goal. And also, it was a love letter to LAR for changing some people's lives. I mean, I have people that I interviewed that told me when they got involved and listened to LAR and went to these clubs, some people were like, they were shy in high school, or they felt like they were outcasts or misfits. But then when they went to these clubs and they listened to this station, it made them feel like they were part of something. And, as human beings, we want to be part of a tribe. It's our tribal being. We all want to belong. We want to belong to something that makes us feel special, empowered. And that's what this station did for people. It brought them joy, it brought them family, it brought them meaning. And it was great to hear some of these fans and their stories about what the station did for them.
Because you're talking about something that doesn't really exist now with a lot of stuff. I don't want to sound like a boring old man, but it's a culture thing, isn't it? It's kind of, you hang out with the people that share the same music, and there's the lowest common denominator that brings you all together. I always say there's nothing like music to take you back to a time and a place, and invariably with a person. When I wrote my book last year, talking about going backstage and meeting Led Zeppelin at 15, in 1969, I was there in the dressing room. I could hear everything, And I don't care what you're into, sport or what, you don't remember a goal, you don't remember an ice hockey moment, but music is that, special moment. It's really hard to kind of, explain it to people who, weren't fortunate enough to experience. One thing I was going to ask you, Ellen, are you in a hurry to get off?
No, I'm okay right now.
I'll tell you what, because I've only got the 40-minute Zoom. So what I was going to do is just send you another invite, because I would like you to talk about, because you talked to Paul McGuinness and The Alarm, and that's a bit of, self-indulgence on my part, because I work with both those artists. So I'd like to hear, because I would imagine that in that period, if that's their way of giving back, because you two didn't have to Paul McGuinness didn't have to turn up and do that, because it's you two. But there's an incredible sense of appreciation that you were so responsible, and you're keeping the legacy alive of one of the greatest stations that ever lived. I mean, I didn't live in America then, but my wife's from Queens, so I knew all about that when she dragged me along to, and then met you and blah, blah, blah. So when I started doing this, it's like, I got to get that girl. So I'll phone you. I'll send you an invite straight back. Thanks very much, Ellen. I'll be 2 secs. Oh, by the way, it takes about a couple of minutes to download. So as soon as you get the invite, click on, and we'll be recording, and I'll just come in with a question. Okay?
Sounds good.
Hang in there.
Okay.